Hi, I'm Bill Kristol. Welcome back to Conversations, and I'm very pleased today to have as our guest Senator Joe Lieberman. Thanks for joining us, Joe.
Great to be with you, Bill. Thank you.
And I look forward to discussing your long, distinguished, varied, interesting public career in public life. Maybe I begin by just asking you, what is there one moment that stands out? What's the most, when you wake up late at night, what's the one moment, flashback moment that comes to you first when you think about that long and distinguished career?
So I've been lucky. I've had a lot of great moments. I mean, I suppose the when I got elected to the Senate in 1988 as an upset winner, that was a big moment. In 2006, after I lost the Democratic primary, ran as an independent and won. That was really a thrilling moment, maybe the most thrilling. But really the most memorable moment, I would say, it would have to be the barrier-breaking opportunity that Al Gore gave me when he asked me to be his running mate in 2000 as vice president, and then that whole campaign and the remarkable aftermath of it. But it was thrilling.
I remember hearing about your pick. I was at a beach house. I remember this. It was like very early in the morning. The news broke. And I went to a radio interview, instant analysis, knowing nothing. I, of course, was happy to pontificate about it. But I mean, how did it happen? How does a vice presidential pick happen? Afterwards, everyone decided Gore-Lieberman, sure, but it was a surprise at the time, as I recall. Was it? To me, it was.
And I would say to you. It was to me too. I would say, to make a long story short, once I got into politics, really my dream was, if you'd asked me when I started out, to be a U.S. senator, and I realized that dream. I never dreamed of being on a national ticket. So how does it start? I mean, I'll try to do this. So this is not the whole conversation, but
so you're a senator from Connecticut,
yeah, I'm a
and
senator
Al Gore
from Connecticut.
gets the Democratic nomination.
I know Al. We've served together. We've worked on things together, and it's probably April of 2000. And maybe it's March, and Warren Christopher, the former Secretary of State, asked if he can come by and see me in my office, and he says that Al Gore has asked him to chair the selection committee for vice president. And I had known Christopher some, particularly on Aspen Institute programs, which he had chaired on relations between the former Soviet Union and the U.S. Anyway, we'd spent time together. So he came to the office, and he told me what he was doing, and he said, I wanted to ask you, for people you would recommend that Al Gore think about. I'm talking to a lot of people. So I mentioned some people. And then he said, would you be interested in being considered? So I naturally said, it'd be an honor. I can't imagine it's plausible, but yes, if sure. So that was that. And then I think that might have been it for that conversation. And then he called me back and said, this was probably early May. I remember it because I took the call in the House, and there may have been one in between this, in the House here in Washington, and my wife Hadassah, our youngest daughter Hani, were there. And it was Christopher, and he said, we've gone all over the names, and Al would like very much to put you on the short list to be considered. Is that okay? You may want to talk to your wife. And there had been one conversation in between where he said that I was under active consideration. And my wife and I had talked about it. Again, we said, this is really an unexpected turn of events. It's exciting and thrilling. It's awesome. It's not going to happen, but if they really want to vet me, then of course we'll do it. I said that to him. I remember we had a funny conversation in which he said, you may want to think about it because this vetting process is very painful. We're going to go over everything in your life. And I'm trying to remember whether it was me, because I knew Christopher well enough. He said, it's like a medical procedure without an anesthesia. So I said, you mean sort of like a colonoscopy without, anyway, without a painkiller? Yes. So I said, yes, if he wants to. And then Hani and Hadassah, I remember this, were not in the room where I took the call. And I said, to paint a picture for you, I said, come on down. We had our living room, dining room, and there were steps upstairs. I said, sit on the steps. I pulled a dining room chair out, and I looked at both of them on the steps. And I told them the story. Oh, my God. So that began a vetting process. I remember that Mike Berman, who was a friend of mine who had been Walter Mondale's campaign manager, and he heard I was being vetted, and he said, he called me up and he said, I'm really glad they're looking at you. He said, honestly, everything is going to be turned upside down in your life. It's interesting because they had the problem with Mondale and Ferraro that year.
Right.
So he said, go home tonight, tell Hadassah to sit down at the table. You sit down directly opposite her, look her straight in the eye and said, sweetheart, is there anything about your past life that I don't know? Because if there is something I should know, it's going to come out. They're going to find it. And she said, oh, don't worry about it. It's fine. So they chose attorney Jamie Gorelick, who's Washington. She had been in the Clinton administration.
Justice,
yeah. And I knew her a little bit, not much, to head the vetting team. They had something like 6 or 7 people working on it. It really was exhaustive. I mean, I remember they told me they sent somebody up to New Haven to read my editorials while I was the editor and chairman of the El Daily News. And I remember that they said that the 2 most radical things I did was, one, to call for the recognition of a country that was then known as Red China. And the second was that I was a very fervent advocate for co-education at Yale. But neither one of those
did much damage.
Did much damage. So we're all keeping it quiet. I mean, I actually had a friend named Jonathan Sallet who was in between jobs, a lawyer, and I realized that they were asking for an enormous amount of personal information, financial. I needed somebody really to organize this, so we quietly hired him, and for not very much, and he did a great job at pulling everything together.
And you kept this totally quiet? I mean, your
we
own
kept
staff,
it very quiet.
Senate staff
Really,
didn't know,
Jonathan was separate. We made sure that the Senate, only one person in the office, my chief of staff, and my executive assistant too, knew, but no one else did. Later on, one of my key people said, I kept wondering, why was Jonathan Sallet around, after it came out. They spoke to a lot of people about me. I'll add this, Bill, because it is interesting. This is a process. I mean, the selection by a presidential nominee, and by that time Al Gore was the clear nominee, is one of the most sort of singular unilateral exercises of authority in American politics. Because it's not that the nominee for president doesn't talk to people, but basically he or she can choose whoever they want. And it's not, clearly this is all quiet, covert, but there's also a way in which you want to advance your cause.
Yeah, right.
But you want to do it subtly. And so, my colleague from Connecticut, Kristol, I took into my confidence, and you will not be surprised to hear that there were some people on the left of the party that we thought might not be enthusiastic about even then.
Yeah.
So he talked to some of the labor unions and some of the education groups, civil rights groups, and then things happened that are totally accidental. A friend of mine who was a businessman, I'll mention him, he passed away, he deserves credit, Sam Heyman. He sensed that I was being considered. He called me up and he said, by coincidence, Al Gore's brother-in-law, his name was Frank Hunger, has represented me in cases, and I'm pretty friendly with him. I'm going to make a pitch to him about why you're the right nominee. And he did, and in a very eloquent letter, really flattering. And, who knows? Because
right.
Frank Hunger was quite close to Al at that time. So this
all goes on behind the scenes.
Goes on behind the scenes.
And then at some moment...
it's going a little later than normally it does, but we're about, probably we're within a week of the convention. And what my wife began to call the bobbing heads on television, that is the rumored nominees, some of which were real and some of which never, I found later, were considered. But the rumored possible selections in that last weekend when it was leaked that Al Gore was going to make his choice were down to it was really quite a threesome: John Kerry, John Edwards, and me. And
but at this point, you haven't had a direct conversation with Vice President
So
Gore?
very important question. About a week or 10 days before this, I get a call from the Vice President's office that he's now interviewing the sort of short list, so to speak. It was probably 5 or 6 people. And in a really ornate process, they tell me that a fellow named Philip Dufour, who's sort of the chief of staff at the residence, is going to come and pick me up in a van with tinted windows.
Is that right?
In my house, and drive me in the back way to the Vice President's residence. So I went in and had a conversation. In a way, it was awkward because Al and I are friends. We were fairly close then. But he really has to interview me.
Yeah.
And, we went over some of the things. And he has to ask me, is there anything about your past that we haven't found out that I should know? Because it is going to come out. I said, as far as I know.
It's just the two of you?
It's just the two of us.
No
We're
staff?
No staff. And it was a cordial conversation. I mean, knew him well enough to joke a little bit. That was it. I mean, it was clear to me that I was being considered, but I still had no knowledge. The weekend before, we were in New Haven, where we lived, and as I end up being one of the final 3, the house is surrounded by an increasing number of satellite TV trucks from all around. It's an amazing, and my neighbors are pouring out, and everybody's wondering what's going to happen. So we hear the decision's going to be made on a Sunday night, and interestingly,
So this is, I think, a week before the convention.
it's a
is
week.
that
The
right?
conventions. This is August already.
Right. So the convention is going to be a week later.
It's going to follow. It's going to start a week Monday.
Right.
So this is Sunday night.
Right.
We know that the decision is being made. I mean, I have people sort of close in the Gore campaign who are telling us things about that evening. My mother had come up from Stanford. She was then about 80. Maybe 85, actually. And I get a call from my press secretary who tells me he's just heard from somebody at one of the networks, and he's sorry to have to be the one to tell me, but they've heard from inside that they've selected John Edwards. So I pull out a bottle of wine. I bring the family together. I said, this was incredible that we got this close. And we have a toast to America and everything. Isn't it wonderful? And we go to sleep, but the TV trucks are out there, and I get up in the morning, and I flip the remote on about 5 of 7 before I'm still in bed in Hadassah, and the local TV anchor is saying, now let me just repeat that really exciting news. The AP is reporting that Vice President Gore has chosen our own Senator Joe Lieberman to be his running mate. What?
So you see this on TV before you get a phone call from
I didn't get a phone call. I wake Hadassah up, all hell breaks loose. I tell you about not getting a phone call from Al Gore. I mean, here, if you want a little local color, one of my few jobs, as Hadassah would tell you in the house, is I make the coffee in the morning. So it's August. I'm in my underwear. So I walk down into the kitchen to make the coffee, and there are TV cameras at each of the windows. So
Go back upstairs.
I go hit the floor. Anyway, we saw things were changing, and people start to call. About 7:30, I'm upstairs. Hadassah yells up, "Joe, it's Al." So I pick up the phone, and the voice on the other end says, "This is fantastic." I said, "Who is this?" Al Fromm.
It was a Democratic political operative.
He was a political guy. Actually, weirdly enough, I had a long-standing previous commitment to speak in Hartford that morning at the state labor convention. And I still didn't know. I thought it was real. I still didn't know. So my campaign manager, Sherry Brown, I called in Hartford, and I said, can you call somebody in?
Plus, you're on the ballot this year for re-election.
I'm on the ballot for senator, right? So that's why I'm going to the labor convention.
Yeah.
So she calls and she says, "Yep, they say it's real. Go to the convention. They want you to go and make a speech." And so we drive up, and I finally hear from Al. I never actually asked him why he didn't call me earlier. I'm coming back to New Haven after I've made the speech. It's probably 12:30 by that time. He calls me in the car, and of course at that time we had these enormous car phones.
Yeah, and there's no email. People I'm sure young people watching are thinking, well, didn't they email?
Did he
or
email
text?
me? No.
But there's no email at this point.
I know.
Or
So, and
virtually.
he says, you probably heard, I want you to be my running mate. I'll tell you a quick story. Stop me if I'm going too long. About 2 weeks later, a really fine reporter named Ron Fournier, who at that point was with the AP, rides to Wilmington, Delaware for a campaign stop. And he tells me, I got to tell you a story, because he was the one who broke the news. Because, frankly, by that time, the Gore campaign didn't trust most of the press. So they gave it to Claire Shipman, who broke it on, I think she might have been with the Today Show at that point, or maybe with ABC. Maybe ABC. And Ron Fournier. And he told me, I'll tell you the story quickly, that they were going to decide, Chris Lehane, who was Al Gore's press secretary, said, we're going to decide tonight and we're calling you. You're going to break it. And so it got to be about 11:30, and he called Lehane and he said, I'm still at the office. Is it really going to be tonight? He says, it is, but go home and just stay by your phone. And apparently Al made the decision after midnight. They called Chris Lehane about 5 or 5. I don't know, they called Ron Fournier about 5 or 5:15. So Lehane, as Fournier tells us to me, says, we made a selection, you're going to break it, but you got to guess who it is. So he says, he's telling me the story, John Kerry. And no, Lehane says, no. John Edwards? No. So he says, I knew it. You're going to the Midwest. It's Evan Bayh. No. And then he says, oh, my God, you're making history. It's Joe Lieberman. Yes. That was the way the story came out.
So fantastic. And so when was and I have this image of you and Hadassah, your wife, and your mother, as I recall, and some of the kids at least, at this very kind of emotional, moving press or statement and press conference. Was that Monday afternoon or Tuesday morning?
So here's an interesting story. Later, there was the Gore campaign assembled a vice presidential management team, campaign manager, press, etc. And they were waiting, they told me later, in Nashville, and they didn't know whether they were going to North Carolina for Edwards, Boston for Kerry, or New Haven for me. They flew up, they came to the house, and then they flew us down to Nashville. I mean, I knew things were changing because as we headed out, the press secretary was Kiki McCain, who I had known some before, and before we go out the door of the house to get in the car to go to the New Haven airport, she says, sir, she always called me sir, even when we were friends, sir, the first reactions to your nomination have been extraordinarily positive. Please do not stop and talk to the press on the way out. So I go out the door of my house, and there are these 3 guys from the Connecticut press, 2 I remember particularly, Mark Davis, Tom Moynihan. I've known them for 30 years. Hey, Joe! So what am I going to do? I go over and talk to him. But she says to me later, I can see you're going to be trouble. Anyway, we were flown down.
So it was the next morning that
the next morning. I'll tell you a quick story. We had a lovely dinner, the Gore family and my family. And Al Gore said at that dinner, he said, I want you to know that I decided 2 weeks ago that I wanted you to be my running mate. But I really thought it would be irresponsible for me to try to talk to some other people about whether they thought America was ready for a Jewish vice president, the proverbial heartbeat away from the presidency. So I always wondered whether Al did a poll. I think if I were him, I would have done a poll, but he said he called a number of friends, and he said to me, I called a number of my Jewish friends, and I called a number of my Christian friends. And here was what I found. Most of the Jews were extremely anxious and uncertain about the reaction to your nomination. He said, every Christian friend I called said there'd be no problem. So then with a little bit of Gore humor, which people don't remember sometimes, he said, so since I know that there are so many millions more Christians in America than Jews, I decided I could choose you, which is what I wanted to do. Anyway, that was it. And then it was announced the next morning at the War Memorial Plaza, big plaza in Nashville. It was thrilling. And Hadassah did something. He asked her to get up and sort of say something. She toasted him at the dinner on Monday night and said, you know, for her personally, she's a child of Holocaust survivors. It was really, I get choked up. It was really unbelievable that she was where she was, with her husband nominated to be the second highest office in America, greatest country in the world. And he said to her afterward, you know, I want you to introduce Joe tomorrow, and if you want to say something like that, say it. And she did. It was really quite moving. It was a great day. A lot of the World War II vets, you know, identified him. It was.
I remember that. I remember her remarks.
So that whole day was really, if you ask me, what's the most thrilling moment, really, and it was. And even though it ended in a strange way it did, I always say not to relitigate the results, but we did get 500,000 more votes, and it vindicated Gore's confidence that America was not going to judge me based on my religion, and it's a wonderful thing to be able to say.
So let's go back to the beginning. How'd you get into politics?
Yeah,
Had you always thought of public life, elected office?
I hadn't always. I've thought about this question, so I'll give you the answer that I've given myself. How did I get into politics? It was no single factor, but I grew up in a religiously observant home. My folks were not in politics at all. They were in community organizations. But from them and from my rabbis, I got a heavy dose of my responsibility to try to improve the world in whatever way I could. So that was one factor. The other factor, I think, second, was when I got to high school particularly, I started to read history and biography. And to make a long story short, I had a sense of how individual leaders could have either a very positive or a very negative effect on
any particular heroes on the positive side?
Well, there's nothing really too unusual about this.
It's okay.
I know. So Churchill was always, and Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt to some extent, but this actually leads to the next, and Truman was a hero, but this leads to the final factor, which was when I was graduating from high school and going off to Yale College, Senator Kennedy was running for president. And for me and a lot of others of my generation, that was a catalytic experience, because he was young, he was articulate, he was cool, and he brought together a lot that I was interested in, and it's a longer story, but the whole idea of being both supportive of a muscular foreign policy, let's say, and being progressive on things like civil rights really gelled for me. So those three things came together and got me interested. I began to pursue it during my college years. Some of it was what I studied. I studied politics and economics, and did a paper my senior year on the then political boss in Connecticut, John Bailey, who was also John F. Kennedy's national chairman of the Democratic Party.
And had been key to helping him get the nomination.
He had, right? And he was part of that he was the link to the old urban bosses, most of whom in the Democratic Party, most of whom were Irish Catholic at the time, and Bailey was very close to them. There was a former governor, then Senator Abe Ribicoff, who really was a kind of hero for me growing up. He was Jewish, so that was clearly part of it. He was a very impressive, kind of can-do, high integrity, sort of moderate. He had a great speech he gave at one point when he was governor with a Republican legislature, which he called the integrity of compromise, really.
That's good.
It still reads well today. So I had some role models, and I went to work for a typical summer internship, summer of 1963 for Senator Ribicoff. It was his first summer here. It was really wonderful. And I got, intoxicated by Washington. I began to think about doing it as a career, although I still would have been much too bashful to have said that to anybody. But if you stopped me when I came out of Yale Law School in 1967 and asked me, what's your dream, Lieberman? And I referred to this briefly before. I wouldn't have told you because it was too presumptuous, but really it was already to go into politics, and really the ultimate was, and probably based on Ribicoff, and to some extent Kennedy's previous, to be a U.S. Senator. And so, as they say, I lived the dream after that.
So you graduate from law school?
Yeah.
And do what?
So I graduated from law school. I end up staying in New Haven, though. I'm from Stamford, Connecticut, and for a lot of reasons that are not relevant to this discussion. And I begin to get involved in community life. I start to volunteer in the Democratic Party. Believe me, nothing very weighty or important. I get active in the Jewish community. I'm in a few community causes. One to save a park, from a highway going through it, classic. And then I get involved somewhat. These were my liberal Democratic days. There's a progressive movement that forms in the state. Well, I'll tell you quickly. 1968 says something about me. The left of the party was all moving for Gene McCarthy against Lyndon Johnson, and I was waiting for Bobby Kennedy.
Yeah.
And when Bobby Kennedy comes in, there's so few the left has gone for McCarthy. The Pauls are waiting for Humphrey,
right.
are sticking with Johnson, and I volunteer for Robert Kennedy, and I end up being some state official, coordinator of the campaign or something. And then I meet a lot of people there. Anyway, I start to get active in 1969 in a reformed African-American man, reformed Democratic campaign for mayor. He loses. And then in 1970, the incumbent state senator in my district, a Democrat, runs for the U.S. Senate. And he's a tough guy. I mean, we later became friends, Ed Marcus. But all the people, state reps and others who were the natural successors to Ed Marcus, they wouldn't declare that they were interested in his seat until he played out the Senate run. I was 27 years old. I was too young and foolish to think that I had anything. I didn't have anything to risk because I didn't have anything. And just talking to people, I felt he was vulnerable. So shortly after he declared for the U.S. Senate, like 2 or 3 months, early in 1970, I declared for his state Senate seat. And, I built up some support. And lo and behold, he loses the nomination, and he comes back and grabs the party nomination away from me. But I challenge him in a primary, and I beat him by, 200 votes out of about 7,500 being cast. I had Senator Ribicoff endorse me because he really didn't like this guy, Marcus, so he gave me some credibility.
So you beat an incumbent Democratic state senator.
I beat an incumbent Democratic state senator. It was really a children's crusade. It was mostly students from Yale and Southern Connecticut, Albertus Magnus, including, incidentally, a tall, likable kid at Yale Law School named Bill Clinton. Really volunteered in the campaign. Later on, when he became president, you could find at least 10,000 people in New Haven who remembered campaigning alongside Clinton, but there were only 7,500 people who voted in the whole primary. This is a lesson. I took a risk, and I'd say to young people interested in going into politics, don't hesitate to take risks. Sometimes when people have come to me in years later and said, I'm thinking of running for this office, what do you think? And I said, well, first, you got to, and I applied this to myself, both in the Senate campaign and the state Senate, and later when I ran against Senator Weicker in 1988. I said, first off, you got to conclude that you can do a better job than the person you're running against, because you got to convince the voters you can do that. You got to have a reason. The second is you've got to feel that it's possible you can win. Now, some people will run even if it's not possible for the principle of it. That was not my nature. But I said, you're never going to be certain you're going to win but it's worth taking a risk. And in that case, in the Senate run particularly, and even when I ran for Attorney General, the biggest steps forward in my career came when I took the biggest risks, and that was certainly the case in 1970 when I got elected to my first office.
And then you're state senator and then Attorney General of Connecticut.
Yeah.
Your statewide position.
State senator for 10 years. Last 6 as majority leader. 6 years when a woman named Ella Grasso was governor. Right. A phenomenal political person. I could spend an hour and a half talking about her. She taught me a lot.
We'll do that in another conversation.
I always felt that if she died in 1980 of cancer, which was very young, and I always thought that if she had lived, she would have been somebody's vice president. She would have been the first woman on a national ticket. She was
She died quite young, right?
She did. She did. Yeah. In 1980, just to show you that not everything was up and away in my career, the incumbent congressman in my district, Bob Jaimo, announced, very surprisingly, that he was retiring. And I had this feeling, I've been 10 years in the state Senate, it's getting a bit repetitive. I had a couple of cases what I knew in Connecticut where people had turned away from opportunities and they never came again. I must admit I never dreamed of being in the U.S. House, but I thought, this is a moment of opportunity. It was a Democratic district. So I declared for the U.S. House. I got the nomination, and I lost the election in the Reagan landslide.
Oh, I forgot that.
Oh, yeah. No, I learned a lot from that, too. I mean, one of the things was...
So that was Reagan's presidential year, and he swept even Republican
he did.
congressional candidates in.
He did.
In your district?
A good guy named Larry DeNardis, who was a moderate Republican by those standards, then beat me. But I learned a lot in that campaign. It is true you learn by losing.
Yeah.
One was that about 3 weeks out, we did the last poll, because we were not polling every day as they do now, and I was 19 points ahead. And Larry DeNardis, with 2 weeks out, started a really negative campaign, TV ads and radio on me. And I'm beginning to hear questions from people, and I call my consultants in Washington. I never had consultants before, and they say, "Don't worry about it. We've seen this. You're 19 points ahead." So
typical.
Anyway, the other thing going on was that throughout most of the campaign, in the Democratic district, nobody's talking to me about Jimmy Carter. And then the last weekend, people are starting to say, I'm voting for you, but I want you to know I'm voting for Reagan. I don't like Carter. And there was a sweep. One of the things we didn't
Reagan
do,
carried this?
He didn't carry the district, but he did. He carried the state. He did quite well.
Yeah.
And one of the other lessons I learned there is that based on that media consultant polling advice, I never responded to my opponent's negative attacks on me, and I never let that happen again in any campaign. So then it was weird because...
And you'd given up your state senate?
Yes, I had given it up, and I'm
Congress,
going around New Haven or wherever I'm going, and people are, after I lose the election, are talking to me like I've died,
Right.
And a voice goes off in my head after about 5 or 6 weeks of this, which says, I just lost an election. I mean, big deal. I'm still alive. So there's an incumbent attorney general. It's not clear he's going to run, but there again, I announced again for the nomination while he was still presumably running. Later, he decided not to run. I got the nomination. I won the election. It was a wonderful. I had 6 great years as attorney general, and then stop me if I'm talking too much.
No,
after I got reelected attorney general in 1986. Right. So my pollster, Stan Greenberg, who was later Clinton's pollster, he was a Yale professor. We had some money left over, and my campaign manager, Sherry Brown, said, let's do an exit poll. And I was thinking about running for governor in 1990. So Greenberg does a poll, and he comes back. I'll never forget what he called us. Went over to his office on a Friday afternoon, and it was like March of '87. And he says, I ran you against 2 of the Democratic congressmen also thinking about running for governor, and you're third. You're in third place because they are intensely supported in their districts. He said, so it's going to be a fight for you to get the nomination in a couple of years. But he said, an interesting number. I ran you against Weicker. I polled Weicker. He's Lowell Weicker, who was the incumbent Republican senator, Maverick, et cetera. His reelect numbers are like 45. And I ran you against him in this poll, and you were behind him by 25 points. But he's only in the low 40s. And when I look back at that, I think, on that basis, they convinced me.
Yeah, right. Well.
So they didn't convince me then, but then the party started to talk to me because they needed a nominee to run against Weicker. They had nobody. I was in the middle of my attorney general term. I didn't have to leave the office. Serendipity, twist of fate. The chairman of the Senate Democratic Campaign Committee then is none other than a guy I knew from Yale, John F. Kerry.
Oh, wow.
And he starts to recruit me to run. And I said to him what I always said to the candidate, young people who came to me, I said, I got to have a reason to vote against this guy. He's very popular. They still think of him as the Republican who turned against Nixon and Watergate. The state has a lot of independence. He's a pro-choice Republican, so they've sort of made him a hero. Anyway, Kerry came back with some stuff on his record that... and then we did another poll later in the year, and basically sort of the same kind of numbers. And I'll never forget, Stan Greenberg said, you're the perfect candidate to run against him, Weicker, because you can run what Stan said, a right-left campaign. You can go to the right of him on crime, which was a big issue then, and on foreign policy. I mean, he had criticized Reagan for blah, blah, blah. And to some extent, you can go to the left of him on environmental protection, because he's got a bad record on environmental protection. So I started this long shot campaign, and it was a tough campaign. He ignored me for most of it. Early in, we had some debates in which I took the fight to him, and it came out pretty well, but still I was behind. I'll never forget, in the middle of September, I was still down 16 points in the polls, and I called the guy who was doing my media then, Carter Rescue here in Washington, and we became very close. I said, "What's going on? We're hitting him with everything." And he said, "Well, it could be that the public has embraced him so tightly because of Watergate and his maverick status that they're not going to let him go. But it could also be that every time we whack him with something, they're loosening the hold, and that something's going to happen and they're going to let him go." And we did this ad that portrayed him as a sleeping bear who sort of stayed in a cave doing what he wanted to do and came out and growled and it fit the public when they wanted. And suddenly the Hartford Courant has this poll, big headline, Senate race is a dead heat. And then Weicker really turns on me and hits me with a lot of negative stuff, and it bounces back and forth, but I win by 10,000 votes out of 1,300,000 cast. It was less than 1%. It was really quite remarkable.
I've always thought that race was a little more of a model than people realized for Clinton in '92 at the presidential level, the ability to be both a moderate, pretty hawkish Democrat, and in Clinton's case, he was, wasn't really to the right of Bush on foreign policy, but certainly didn't let Bush get to the right of him, I would say, on foreign policy and defense, and also was going to reform welfare and embraced a couple of not conventional liberal causes, but also attacked, I was part of that administration, the Bush administration, and the normal anti-Republican attacks on environment and social issues and so forth. So
I think you're right,
and you were close to, so Clinton was then governor of Arkansas, and you guys had stayed in touch.
Right. So Stan Greenberg, my pollster, was also his pollster in '92. So there's the most direct connection. But Bill Clinton had become active in the Democratic Leadership Council, the moderate Democratic group, which Al Fromm and others formed after the '84 Reagan victory over Mondale. And as Al once said to me, with the goal, Al was then probably in his 40s, he said our goal was to see if we could elect a Democratic president in his lifetime. Right. He was in his 40s. And of course, then Clinton became chairman of the DLC. I reconnected with him through the Democratic Leadership Council, and I supported him quite early. I actually committed to him in '91. He did a cute thing. He called me up, said, this was '91, and he said, "You remember in 1970 when I was at Yale Law School, I supported you for state senate?" And I said, "I do, Governor." And he said, "And you won, right?" I said, I did. You helped me a lot." And he said, "Well, you owe me." And so it was a little joke, but because he knew I was going to support him anyway. So I did work hard for him early on. And I think he did, in some ways, I hadn't thought about it, but you're probably right that our campaign in '88 created a certain precedent for what he tried to do.
You won, Dukakis lost. I think it showed that you could run as a more complicated kind of Democrat and not antagonize necessarily the liberal base, though.
Correct. Now, that all changed later on in my career, particularly around the Iraq War, when the party lost that whole strong foreign policy defense
we need to get to that. I can't tell you how cheered up I am, though, by the fact that, don't take this the wrong way, that you lost that congressional race in 1980, because I've been saying for years that successful politicians and successful leaders in America seem to always have at least one loss in their background, which I think for me is interesting because it shows that they took risks. They didn't just run the safe races. And I think, as you said, people often learn from losses. And someone once said to me, well, but Lieberman's the exception to this. But
no.
But you're not. Obama lost a primary in 2000. Right. Remember when he ran for Congress first? Clinton lost a governor's re-elect race. George W. Bush lost a congressional race. Reagan lost, of course, famously. Yeah. So, as I say, I'm cheered up that you're part of this
well, it really made the irony of that 1980 campaign is that was supposed to not be a risk. In other words, as the Democratic candidate for Congress. And my whole attitude when I ran again, the truth is if I had lost my Attorney General race, probably my political career would have been over. But having lost the congressional and still realized that I was alive and that there were other parts of life, I actually ran with less inner tension. It's a strange thing to say, having lost. And of course, as I said, I learned some specific things about that, which is, and they're very practical. Try to keep polling, and so you see daily, if you can afford it, see any changes that are going on. Right. And also, if people attack you, you got to respond. Otherwise, the negatives will seep in. The third is to try to make a case for yourself.
I want to talk about public policy in your years in the Senate, but
Yeah.
let's do one more election, which was
Sure.
another famous one. You actually had quite a few of them, which was '06, where in a very unusual way you lost a primary and then won as an independent. So you were challenged by an anti-war Democrat, obviously, and since you had been a defender of the Iraq War, which had become very unpopular by '06.
So I supported the Iraq War, as almost everybody did at the beginning, including most Democrats, and they vote to authorize it in 2002, 2003. But, I just felt that if and then there was a very strong anti-war movement, mostly in the Democratic Party, and I felt that if we did what they wanted us to do, which was to pull out of Iraq, it would have been disastrous, not only for Iraq, but for America and our foreign policy, our credibility. So I stuck with it, and I began to get I got really negative reactions, generally, and including back home. It really alienated me from a lot of the left of the Democratic Party, and frankly some of the middle too, who were anti-war and anti-Bush.
Well,
President Bush became such a polarizing figure to them. So that a lot of them read it as, not that I was sticking with the Iraq War for reasons of foreign policy, American national interest, but somehow I was doing it for President Bush. Just the fact that he and I might have had reached the same policy conclusions never dawned on a lot of those people. And
you had supported Senator Kerry in 2004
I
against
did.
Bush, obviously. So
did.
You were a loyal Democrat and all that, but didn't do any good at that point, I guess.
No, it didn't. It really got, to me, irrational. At the end of 2005, we did a poll, and I met with that same consulting team, Carter Rescue, Stan Greenberg, Sherry Brown. And I remember Carter said, I think you should think about running as an independent for re-election, because I'm looking at these numbers. I have a sense of what's happening in the anti-war movement. I think if somebody comes along and challenges you in a primary, particularly if they have some money, but even if they don't, you're going to be at risk. And I got sort of my back up, and I said, the hell with that. I mean, I've been a Democrat all my life. Generally speaking, though I've been a moderate Democrat, more often than not, I voted the way most of the Democrats in the Senate have. I just refused to leave the party because of one issue. I can't believe they're going to throw me out for that issue. But they did.
You're right.
And it was actually quite painful. I mean, if you asked me earlier, Bill, what was the most thrilling moment of my career, I mentioned several, but the most was the vice presidential. That whole primary campaign and the loss on that primary day was really painful because a lot of people that I thought were friends and that I had done things for, like unions that I had, supported in various ways. Like I was one of the defense unions, the machinists. And I'd worked so hard to get stuff for Pratt Whitney. They went based on the war of all things. They went for my opponent, and so it was quite a bitter pill. But I had decided that I wasn't going to give up. I wasn't going to let the Democratic primary voters essentially decide whether I deserved to be reelected, and so I ran as an independent, and honestly, that was probably, ironically, second to the vice presidential. Winning that election as an independent was probably hard to believe this, but even more exciting to me than getting elected to the Senate over Weicker in the first place, because it was a vindication of me, but it was also a vindication of my faith in the system, because the Iraq War didn't have the support of a majority of people in Connecticut, so a lot of people in Connecticut who didn't support what I was doing on the war basically said, this guy is, he's okay. He's doing what he thinks is right. He's obviously not doing it for political reasons because he's not that dumb, because he could have gotten reelected, renominated easily if he came out against the war. So, and he's done a good job for us. And so I got a great mix of, that year, the Republican candidate was a good guy, but not a strong candidate. And I think a lot of Republicans, frankly, right up to the White House, felt that I had been punished for sticking with the president's policy, and they supported me. I got over 70% of the Republican vote. And
but people forget it was a surprise. I mean, I remember the day after you lost the primary, and people were saying, well, his career's over. And I don't think you had signaled quite yet. You certainly hadn't signaled before the primary that you were going to run as independent. I guess you did pretty soon after.
I actually had to do it before because of state law. It was very compromising because I had to file the day after the primary, which was probably a way that the incumbents were trying to make sure that nobody who lost the primary could run as an independent. So we had actually started circulating petitions before.
I forgot that.
I must say in that campaign that one of the most thrilling things that happened is that all of a sudden ads began to appear in Connecticut television by a group called Vets for Freedom.
Right.
And I didn't know who they were, but they actually, I teared up at one of them. They were Connecticut vets of the Iraq War who supported my candidacy and said he had our back, now we have his. And after the election, I found out that Bill Kristol had put this whole idea together.
I'm not quite put together, but I helped them a little bit. They were a great great kids.
They were great.
They just needed to be connected with some people who would give
well,
some
anyway,
money. But I'm happy to have played a tiny role in that. And so you had 6 more years in the Senate until you decided.
And they were productive years. The last two, the place became so partisan. My last two in the Senate, but. John McCain said, it was my good friend, said to me at one point, after I lost the VP and the presidential, he said after he lost the presidential in 2000, he had some of his most productive years in the Senate. And the truth is, it happened that it was after 9/11, Susan Collins, first Fred Thompson and I, and then Susan Collins and I were the leaders of the Governmental Affairs Committee that worked on post 9/11 legislation, and really it was very bipartisan. A lot of good stuff was adopted, and I feel very good about that.
So you served 4 terms in the Senate with a lot of very impressive, interesting, controversial characters from both parties. I mean, who stands out? What should we know? What's different from what the rest of us think just watching it from afar about being a senator and working with the other senators?
Yeah. So beneath all the headlines and all the rest, the Senate is still 100 people who go to work in the same place every day, or every day they're in session. And so personal relations matter a lot. I remember when I first came in, Democrats were in the majority, maybe at 54, 55. George Mitchell was the incoming majority leader, and he said to me, pick out 2 or 3 areas that you're really interested in, and learn them so that your colleagues know that you know what you're talking about. And he said, you're going to have more influence even as a freshman than you think, because there's hundreds of issues, and inevitably we rely on each other. So unfortunately, over the 24 years I was there, that was true when I first came in, although you could see partisanship beginning to eat away at that. But at the end of my 24 years, it was really so partisan that it was hard to make the combinations to get to 60 votes to break a filibuster, to get things done. Although anything I'm proud of, the Clean Air Act in 1990 with the Bush 41 people, the effort to get the U.S. and Europe to stop the genocide aggression in the Balkans, which was done with Bob Dole, and Joe Biden, John McCain, and me. It was really something. And all the work I did with Fred Thompson and Susan Collins post 9/11, and then again with Susan Collins on the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, they were all bipartisan. And anyway, the personal relations matter. Part of what's happened in the Senate over the years, I think, is that there's not enough time for personal relations anymore.
Right.
People fly in Monday. There's usually a what we would call a bed check vote. Nothing major. Monday afternoon, 5:30, and then you're there for a couple of days. And as majority and minority leaders will tell you, their members start to pester them. What time are we getting out today? I got to get home. I got an event. I got a fundraiser somewhere. God knows. So there's not much interaction. In the old days, they spent more time in Washington. I mean, in the really old days, which aren't so long ago, the Congress would come in January and they'd stay till the late spring. A lot of them never went home at that time. Then they'd go home for the summer. That's why people say one of the worst things that ever happened to Congress is air conditioning.
Right.
Right. And probably air travel, too. Working with people meant a lot. That if they trust you, they think you know what you're talking about, you can build the kinds of relationships that get things done. And those are the most satisfying moments. Sometimes when you do that, you fall out of favor with some people in your party, but that's not why. You're not there to please the people in your party. You're hopefully there to get something done. So who were some of the most interesting people? Well, Bob Dole is a wonderful man.
Right. Contrary to his public image, somewhat of very crusty and sardonic.
Yeah, just a good guy and a good pal, but really quite principled. I mean, I talked about Bosnia. Bob Dole started to try to get us to do something to stop the aggression in the Balkans when President Bush 41 was president. He didn't wait till Clinton came in.
Right.
In other words, he was president of his own party. I ended up in '91 in the vote to authorize the Gulf War. I was a freshman, but I made very clear that I was going to support the authorization. Everybody, more senior people, were Democrats, much to my dismay, were bobbing and weaving, ultimately went negative. So I got asked to co-sponsor the war authorization resolution with John Warner, and it passed 52 to 47. Very close. I'm very proud that it did. And Dole is an example. I was on the floor after the vote, and his aide came over to me and said, Senator Dole wants you in his office right away. You got to come right there. So I said, okay. And he's he's got the one arm, and he's holding the phone. It was here. I'm calling the president to tell him to vote. Now, this seems like when was this, the 19th century?
Yeah, right.
It's possible the president knew about the vote. Maybe somebody had called him, but it was not all instant.
Right.
And
a formality, anyway, is to call the president if you're the leader of the party.
Right.
Yeah.
So, exactly. So he wanted me to be there, which was very kind of him, put me on the phone. Anyway, he's just a good.
That's so hard to believe these days, though.
The
Republican leader putting a Democratic senator on the phone.
Yeah, exactly. And he went out of his way. I didn't know the call was going to occur.
Right.
Just a good guy and a principled guy and a great internationalist,
Right.
And he'd do unpredictable things, too, which I always liked about him. Great sense of humor. We'll come back for your late night show, and I'll tell you some of the more off-color jokes that Bob Dole.
I'd love to hear those. Excellent.
Pat Moynihan, when I came in, was a real influence on me. He was from neighboring New York, very bright. I mean, I'll tell you something interesting about Pat Moynihan. I watched him, and I noticed that on a lot of votes, he would come in. There's a table on each side of the well of the Senate, Democratic side, Republican side, and the staffs put a brief description of what's being voted on when the roll call goes off, and they'll say the majority leader asks a no vote or an aye vote, or the chairman of the committee asks. And I noticed Moynihan would come in very often and just look at it and vote. And I once said to him, Pat, I'm really fascinated by this. And I went through the whole story. He said, I've decided that on most of these votes, it doesn't matter to people in New York, and I'm probably going to vote with the majority leader or the chairman. So unless I've got some interest from New York, or I know about it myself and I'm concerned about it, I'm just going to vote because it's a waste of time for me to. So, and usually he was in his hideaway, reading, writing, and probably drinking. He was one of the last of the drinkers, but he could do better with a couple of drinks in him. He was more eloquent and more sensible. He prioritized. That's the important thing I want to say about him. Every session, he had one or two big issues that he focused on, and generally speaking, he got it done. I missed him when he passed away.
I think he learned that from being somewhat in the executive branch, too. And you, of course, also were as Attorney General. I do think people who've got some executive branch experience at the state or national level understand that you've got to have priorities. There's only 2 or 3 things you're going to make a difference on in any term. Yeah. And you've got to sort of focus on those.
Yeah, it's a lesson that'll, and the executive experience helps you, but the natural pull of the Senate life has you involved in hundreds of issues because you're responding to input, or you find the whole thing so appealing that it's hard to say no to anything.
Right.
John McCain and I became very good friends, and I have the greatest respect for him. It started really around foreign and defense policy when we started to travel together around the world. It's one time when you get to know your colleagues because you're away from Washington. Often you're on long plane rides. And McCain and I became and still are really good friends. And so I cherish that particularly. Susan Collins, working very closely with her. We're similar political people. You might say, speaking simplistically, a moderate Republican, moderate Democrat. We both wanted to get things done. We made one of those agreements that really, in the old days, made the Senate work and still should, where we were never going to surprise each other. There would be times when I couldn't do what she wanted, she couldn't do what I wanted.
So this was the Homeland Security Committee, which you chaired?
We chaired, and we rotated depending on who was the majority chair and ranking member, and it was a wonderful relationship, really. So, I mean, those are some of the great names that come to mind, people that
And presidents, and so you worked with, I guess, Bush, Clinton, Bush, and President Obama a little bit.
Right.
Anything striking about those? I mean, how different is it to work with each of them, or is it always the same? The White House is the White House.
Or it is different. I mean, I was new when President Bush 41 came in. I had great respect and affection for him. I knew him a little bit, but I didn't have a lot of interaction. Clinton, I was quite close to, and close to the whole White House operation, and he's a remarkable man. I mean, I've been thinking about him now when we're now talking in October of 2014, and it's probably more likely than not that the Republicans will control both houses of the Congress after the election in a week or so. And Clinton faced that in 1994 and went right at Newt Gingrich, and he was like that with everybody. The contrast with President Obama, unfortunately, Obama's very smart, ideas, but has not worked the Congress very well. And people are, even those who are loyal to him, don't see him, don't talk to him very much. Clinton spent an enormous amount of time on it. I was sitting at, last year I was in the Senate, I was sitting at a table in the Senate happened to be at the Senate Democratic Caucus, and one of the colleagues said, when's the last time any of you talked to President Obama? So I said, he turned to me and I said, well, about 6 weeks ago I got a call about something that was in my committee. Wow, 6 weeks ago. So this guy, who was the chairman of one of the major committees, I haven't seen him or talked to him in 6 months. Jeez. And then we started talking about Clinton, and I remember saying, Clinton, he'd call you, and the problem was, how do I get him off the phone? I mean, he would just, until he got your agreement to do what he wanted you to do.
And you criticized him for his personal behavior, obviously, in the Lewinsky scandal, and he got over that?
Well, it was really interesting. Very hard thing for me to do because I liked him, but I really felt what he did was awful, and that unless I felt myself, if I didn't say something, I'd be a hypocrite. I also felt that if somebody who was supportive of him didn't say something, it would not be good. And so it got a lot of attention. I got a call from Erskine Bowles, who was chief of staff about 3 or 4 days later, saying that he was going to express an opinion which wasn't universally held at the White House. He thought I helped the president by bursting the boil. That was a metaphor he used. The following Sunday morning, I'm at home, and the phone rings. It's the White House. And so now about a week and a couple of days since I made the speech, the president says, it was the president, I just want you to know that there's nothing you said in that speech that I don't agree with. And I want you to know that I'm working on it and I'm seeing this. And we talked for about 45 minutes. It was amazing. And then, as I told you off camera, I'll repeat it briefly. On the day that Al Gore selected me to run for vice president, or the story was leaked, I was still at my home in New Haven. President Clinton called. Oh, he's so happy. He said, you understand from the DLC, Democratic Leadership Council, what we're all about. You're the perfect person to do this. And because of the speech you made about my personal mistakes, Al Gore now can run on our record. He doesn't have to be defensive about what I did. I mean, it was just really unbelievable. I always wondered, of course, notwithstanding the fact that we continued to see each other around, Clinton and I around Washington after I made the speech, really how did he feel? And I think that's the way he felt. So President Bush 43, I didn't know. Obviously, I was on the ticket against him. I didn't know him. I'll tell you a quick story. After I'm at his inauguration, I go back into the Capitol, and Tom Daschle has hot coffee and stuff in his office, so I go in. I come out the door with my wife, Hadassah, and coming around the corner is the president, the new president, and the Secret Service. He's gone into the so-called presidential room, where he signed the official documents to accept the presidency.
Wow.
And he says hello, President Bush does, and says, your being on the ticket made it closer than it would have been. So I said, thank you, Mr. President. I don't know if that's true, but thank you. And I hope we have an opportunity, if there's ways in which we agree on things, we'll work together. And he said, with that Bush look, I think we're going to find some ways. Now, little did I know.
Yes, right.
So we worked together on, some sort of. Well, first thing I did with him was support of faith-based groups.
Right.
I did that later, and that was pretty early in February. And then, of course, we got involved in the whole Iraq War. And he was, in his own way, in a story that's yet to be told, after I lost the primary, I think he let the word out to people in the Republican Party, including people who were contributors, that they should do everything they can to make sure that I didn't go down, because that they felt I was being punished for having supported the same policy that he wanted, and at least on one vote, which was a one-vote difference, having stopped the Senate from cutting off funding. My opponent had a pickup truck which went around, followed me everywhere in Connecticut that year, which had two replicas, one of President Bush and one of me, and we were embracing each other. And that was just supposed to be enough.
Wow.
To some say kissing each other, but really that went too far.
And you got reelected. In fact, you were a key player in making the surge possible in 2007, which in turn led to what seemed at the time to be and was at the time, a decent outcome in 2008.
It was.
Unfortunately, it's not been sustained. But
so I thought President Bush, he wasn't probably as active with Congress as Clinton was, but he was pretty good. He's a very good man, really. Yeah. And I think, as is already happening, his presidency is going to be viewed generally more positively than it was when he left office.
Well, on that bipartisan note, let me thank you for joining me today. We'll have a second installment with the off-color jokes from Bob Dole, more stories of you and Bill Clinton.
Yeah, that'll be probably for pay TV.
Yeah, exactly right. Good idea. Thank you, Joe, and thank you very much for joining us for Conversations.